But great to have you here. And as you know, today we're talking about this is the second session in a trilogy around how to earn respect and influence amongst the C suite. And it was interesting, I came across a very interesting quote over the weekend. Most boards suggest they're customer centric, but unfortunately, only a few hold a chair for the CX leaders who actually know the customer best. If CX isn't at the boardroom table, then surely the customer isn't at the boardroom table. And I just think that's a nice way to open it up today. Kingsley Aikens, as you remember, who led the first session, was really about how to make sure that you are positioning yourself to be recognized. And he says the key element there is to give some thought to what do people say about you when you leave the room. And I thought that was a lovely way from Kingsley's session to summarize what it is. And it's not about building legacy, it's about earning respect. So you were invited. So today, guys, just welcome everybody. First of all, Siobhan is going to co-host with me here today. Louise, who is going to manage questions and has got us all on board. And Ian, thank you so much for joining us today. And all I can say is, rather than me attempting to give an intro about you, I'm going to allow you to do that. I suspect you might do it better than I. Can I, first of all, welcome and give us a little introduction, and then I'll jump in with questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. And it is such a pleasure to be joining you and my friends from CX Academy and everyone that's listening into this. It's lovely to see names, so many names that I recognise from all around the world. As you know, I'm Ian. I very pedantically call myself a customer experience specialist. And in fact, that's probably important for me to stress, especially with the subject of this webinar, because I think to earn respect and influence, it's important the way we do introduce ourselves. And I'm very pedantic about using the word specialist because in my experience, I do not like the word expert, because expert suggests that I know everything. And I really don't know everything. Those of you that know me know I don't know everything. I've got many things wrong in my career and I will continue to get things wrong. And my role as a specialist is to never stop learning. And I make it very clear to any CEO, any senior leader that I speak to, that that is the case. And every single week I learn something new about my vocation. And I do call what I do a vocation. It's not a job. This is what I believe I was brought to the business world to do. And I've been doing this for over 30 years. Unlike Michael, I've not gone grey. So I don't know what that means. You can draw your own conclusions. I have now worked in 65 countries, every industry you can possibly imagine, public sector, private sector, everything in between. And as I've said to Michael before, I used to think that nothing would surprise me, but I'm still surprised, and not always positively, by the things that I see on my travels around the world. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you all today to share some of my thoughts, and it helps all of you develop your specialism. I will be delighted.
Brilliant, brilliant. And Ian, we have got to know each other over the years. And I remember sitting in one of your sessions and you introduced me to the authority approach. And I wanted to kick off there. Louise, could you put that up as a slide just to guide Ian as a prompt to take us through? Because the real question there was, Ian, CX professionals, how can they command and contribute strategically by using that approach? And if you that might be a good way to kick this off, and then we'll follow up with some other thoughts.
Yeah. Well, this is something that I talk about a lot. Anyone who's ever attended one of my masterclasses may well have heard me talk about this before, but I know there will be many of you that have never seen this before. Building, developing, earning authority as a CX professional is vitally important, because we are working with a discipline that, whilst it's spoken about a lot around the world, it's still largely misunderstood. And if we're going to be able to influence an organization to change the way it thinks, to change the way it acts, That's really not an easy thing to do. But what I always like to tell everyone is that if you're going to become a CX professional, you work within the profession that customer experience has become. It's incredibly challenging. Changing an organization is difficult for anyone, whatever level of the organization you happen to be. But as a result, what we need to recognize is that the likelihood of any organization transforming itself to become sustainably customer centric is extremely unlikely without people like us. I like to use the very British expression, Michael, of blowing smoke up people's trouser legs. In other words, massaging egos. And to a degree, we need to massage each other's egos because doing what we do is so challenging that it's important that we reassure each other that actually customer-centric transformation needs us to do what we do, however hard it is. And as you can all see from this image, I believe that there are different types of authority that we can consider leveraging to influence and enable our organizations to transform. Now, the first type of authority is the blue line in the middle of this image. It is the authority that I call positional authority. In other words, the position that you hold in the organization. The reality is that the majority of experience management professionals around the world do not sit at the top table. Very few customer experience practitioners sit on the board of directors, the executive team of their organization. In my own personal example, I spent 7 years driving customer experience for an online retailer. I was actually 4 levels below the CEO. If you're 4 levels below a CEO, no one is going to listen to you. And this is incredibly common. We often do not have the position to influence change. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do anything. What it means is we need to leverage the 2 other types of authority, starting with the top line, the orange line that we call borrowed authority. In other words, whose authority can we borrow that does have the position? Now, many customer experience practitioners are very eagerly trying to influence CEOs with a belief that you've got to get the CEO on board. And I don't completely disagree with that. But borrowing authority is not just about borrowing it from the person with the biggest job title. Borrowing authority is all about determining whose authority can you borrow that will enable others to listen, others to engage with what you're trying to do. Sometimes borrowing authority can come from outside the organization. I've been an advocate for many years of finding CEOs or senior leaders from other organizations, external to you. Very often it's the CX professional trying to do the influencing, but your organization probably knows that you get it. It is sometimes more effective to borrow the authority from someone from a different organization, in a different country, from a different industry, to come and talk to your leaders. I have borrowed the authority of CEOs from B2B organizations to come and speak to B2C CEOs in the past. Just hearing other leaders talking about why experience management is important to them can make a difference. I would also urge you within the organization to borrow authority not just from CEOs, but CFOs. We do not spend enough time influencing leaders who hold the purse strings. They can often open more doors than CEOs themselves. What you need is to borrow the authority of someone who your leadership team, those that you need to be influenced, will listen to. there are many examples I can give you. I've borrowed the authority of CEOs. I've also borrowed the authority of fellow CX practitioners. I will never forget asking Bruce Temkin, one of the pioneers, if you like, of customer experience as we know it today, to speak to my boss in 2009, just again demonstrating how old I am. That conversation was fascinating because in an hour, Bruce said to my boss what I'd been saying to my boss for the previous 12 months, almost word for word. At the end of the hour, we terminated the video call. My boss looked at me and said, "Wow, that was amazing." And I'm like, well, I've been saying the same stuff for 12 months, but just borrowing the authority from someone else made such a huge difference. However, the problem with borrowing authority is it can have an impact very quickly, but it doesn't last for very long. Borrowing authority can sometimes actually push you into a position where you become irritating. If you're relying too much on the CEO to speak for you, it can actually become counterproductive. What you've got to be doing while you're borrowing authority is working really hard on the third line, the green line, that we call earned authority. We need to be able to earn the authority so our position in the organization becomes completely irrelevant. Now, how do you earn authority? Well, one way is through the gathering of experience. I've earned authority to a degree because I've now done this for a very long time. But not everyone has worked in this field for over 30 years. So what if you haven't got that longevity? Well, making sure that you are constantly demonstrating your knowledge in this subject is important. This is why I, Michael, Siobhan, Louise are so keen on sharing knowledge and developing knowledge. As many of you will know, I am a CCXP. I have the professional qualification from the CXPA. I am constantly listening, attending various workshops and sessions around the world to keep learning. The CX Academy has shared knowledge with thousands of people around the world to enable them not just to get a certificate. It's not about the certificate. It's about the development of knowledge so you can then practically apply that knowledge to demonstrate to your organization that you know stuff. I call customer experience a science. Just calling it a science, it's remarkable how leaders look at you as if, is it? Oh, explain it to me. We need to earn authority so people want to listen. I used to be very concerned about job title. Why am I not a chief customer officer? Why don't I have this big job title? It's taken me many years to realize that job title is irrelevant. That's not what earns you the authority. What earns you the authority is to be very, very good at communicating what you do, sharing knowledge with others, demonstrating the science of customer experience, not just sharing theory, but helping organizations understand how to operationalize that theory. That's what earns you authority. Having qualifications helps. Having recognition in the form of academic achievement is important, but it's the combination of that academic achievement, the practical delivery of the experience, and your ability to communicate effectively that earns you the authority. And I'll just conclude, because Michael and Siobhan know I could talk for hours without drawing breath, that it's really, really important that in addition to everything I've said, we earn authority through sincerity and authenticity. Doing what we do is very tough because the only way, in my opinion, a CX practitioner can be incredibly effective at influencing change is if the people, the organizations they're influencing, recognize that what they're doing is for the benefit of the organization. For the benefit of the organization, its colleagues, and its shareholders. If a customer experience professional is doing what they do because they want a bigger salary and a better job title, that is going to limit their ability to influence transformation. Everyone I've ever worked with knows that what I'm doing is not for me. It's not about me. Customer experience cannot be about you. It's got to be about the organization. And I'll just finish by telling you the biggest mistake I've made. One of the biggest mistakes I've made in my career is that when I was a practitioner on the inside, I thought earning authority meant that it was me that always had to be the one doing the talking. And it took me a while to realize that that's not the case. I spent too long being the one doing the talking, and I needed to have the confidence in myself to let others do the talking for me. What became far more effective was when I had other leaders, leaders who my colleagues didn't think got it, being the ones doing the talking. It was me driving it, but I needed my voice to come from others. And that is what really moved what I've done in my career to the next level. So I hope that sort of sets the
Yeah,
scene of
no,
what I mean by all of this. But
one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I think you've just answered it there, was when you consider from your own experience, and you kind of share that there, what is the biggest mistake that CX professionals are making when they're trying to gain that credibility at the C-suite?
yeah,
And what you're saying there is
there are
let
others.
others do
So
the
so
talking.
that's one of them. But
Yeah.
there are there are so many when you think about it. But in addition to, you see, one of the problems with being the person who does all of the talking is that you then maneuver yourself into a position where the organization thinks that customer experience is you. And that is what my organization thought. Well, customer experience is Ian. So it isn't.
Mm.
Customer experience is the organization. It's not Ian. And sometimes you have to make these mistakes because that helps you to learn and to be better at it. But the other mistake, very significant mistake that I have made throughout my career, is leading too much through passion. Now, customer experience is a subject, it's a discipline where it's sort of partly in the head and partly in the heart. And many CX practitioners are, like me, incredibly passionate about this
Mhm.
subject. I called it a vocation. It's not even a job, it's a vocation. But the problem is that if we lead from the heart, that will often be used against us
Mm.
because it's quite unusual for people in business to believe in what they do so much that it comes from the heart. Okay. And that can often be quite threatening to business leaders when you're so passionate about something. I have been called all sorts of things by business leaders, some of which I can't possibly mention in a forum like this. But I've been called emotionally immature by leaders who they can't get their head around. How can this person believe in something so much? But actually, to a degree, they were right because I was letting my emotion get carried away. I was leading too much with the heart and not enough with the head. And it's why I want people to recognize that this is a fact-based methodology. I'm not saying lose the passion, but lead with the facts. Let the passion support those facts. Never lose the passion. But if you lead with the passion, you're working with people who don't share that, and they will use that against you. And
Yeah.
that's why many CX professionals will sometimes feel patronized, they will feel humiliated, they will feel belittled. And it does feel personal. It's not personal,
Mm.
actually, that they really don't care about you as a person. What they care about is preserving their own situation. And
Mhm.
having someone that believes so much in doing the right thing to a degree contradicts what many executives are doing, which is not the right thing.
Ian, that's fascinating because I would fall into the same trap, I suspect, time and time again in terms of the passion. But if you back up, what I'm hearing here for the first time with you is the science element, and so here's my question to you based on that: if the science exists, why are we finding it so difficult
Oh,
to justify return on investment across our discipline
well,
if the science is there?
there's a very easy way of answering that. The easy way seeing that saying that the science is not being applied effectively. I would argue, and I do argue, that we are still far too theoretical as an industry. There are too many people who are still just spreading far too much theory. Um, that is not always the practitioner. We live in a world where many large organizations are still influenced by big consulting. I've been told by CEOs in the past that, we use big consulting, I won't mention names, because they're a comfort blanket,
Mm-hmm.
but what big consulting will provide is a huge amount of theory. Big consulting have rarely operationalized customer experience, which is the term that I keep intentionally
Yeah.
using. They know the theory, but they don't know how to apply the theory. And so I think as a discipline, we've done a good job over the last 15 to 20 years of putting the theory into the mindset of people. But leaders know what the theory is, they get it. What they still don't understand is how do you apply it? And it's only when you apply it that you will realize the impact. I like to refer to return on investment as impact. But if you cannot demonstrate the impact, then you're applying it wrong.
Mm.
It sounds quite blunt, but unfortunately, and you've heard me, Michael, give some very bold statements. Most organizations around the world are still applying the science ineffectively, and that's why they're finding it difficult to demonstrate what the impact is.
Yeah. So Ian, here's before Siobhan, I'm going to get you in this in a second, but just before I do that, what separates a CX leader who gets the seat at the table from those who are permanently stuck presenting sites, presenting arguments, but no one acting on it?
Um,
What's the kind of what
so,
separates
so
one from the other?
I can only speak with brutal honesty, which, as you know, is a phrase that I like.
Exactly.
Um, it's difficult. Okay, we have to be realistic. I think some of us are. When I say us, I'm sort of talking about the collective us. That's everyone watching this.
Yeah.
Some of us are not designed as human beings for corporate organizations. Okay, this is a really big thing for me to say. I now know with hindsight that actually I operate more effectively on the outside than the inside because I am not prepared to play the political game that many leaders will play to get to the top table. I now know that I would never have got to the top table because I'm not a political corporate animal. I can only do what I think is right. And you will never get to the top of an organization if that is the case, unless you're in an organization that was created with that sort of moral underpinning from the beginning. And I know that now. I didn't understand that in the past. So I think it's really important that if you are going to be able to make it to the top table, and I've met many brilliant practitioners who do,
Mm-hmm.
they are more politically correct than me. They are the ones who will bide their time. That they won't try to fight every single battle as it happens. They will be very careful in the way that they manage relationships with other people around the table. The challenge here is pace. Coming back to mistakes, the mistake that I and many others make is that we want this transformation to happen quickly because, well, it's obvious. It's so obvious to us, but it's not necessarily obvious to others. And if this is where if you let your passion lead, you're going to try and force people through this when they're not even ready for it. And those that are very politically savvy know how to do that. They can hold back. They can just deal with the frustration. It's fine. I'll tell you another quick story. I worked with you may have heard this one, Michael, but I worked with my first ever client as a consultant. And this client gave me 6 weeks to go and tell them what was wrong with their organization from a customer experience perspective. Now, I'd spent 17 years on the inside of organizations. Now someone was asking me to go and help them. Now, that in itself was like, whoa, they want me to do this. As a practitioner, it often feels like we're pushing water uphill. Now they want me to do it. And I came back 6 weeks later to the boardroom and they said, Ian, tell us what you found.
Mm.
And I told them everything I found. And they agreed with everything I said. Now, in 17 years as a practitioner, people disagreed with everything I said. Finally, they're all agreeing. It's like, my God, yeah, we agree. But the mistake I made is when they asked me, what do we do about it? That was the mistake. Because I got so excited because I was leading from the heart, I told them everything. I said, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. They were ready to acknowledge they had a problem. They weren't ready to do anything about it yet. And I didn't read it. It just didn't register in my mind. And what actually happened is that I went backwards, not forwards, because they disagreed with everything I'd said in the following 2 hours. Now I know in hindsight what I
Mm.
needed to do, and what effective CX leaders do is I should have read the room and I should have said to them, right, the first thing we need to do is this. And that's it. It's
Yeah.
all about understanding what can they accommodate. And I've said for years now, you have got to go at the pace the organization can accommodate. And I've seen that Nazia has just put in the chat change readiness. I created a customer experience readiness model 14 years ago, actually, as a result of that experience, because we've got to determine how ready for this is the organization.
Mm.
And if you go too hard, too fast, you'll actually be blasted backwards.
Interesting. Leon, I'm going to give you a chance to take a breath, okay? Siobhan, let me roll something at you because I think in our courses, particularly the diploma, we focus heavily on getting buy-in from leadership and the executive team throughout those courses. What does that actually look like in practice rather than theory? What does getting buy-in look like?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, let me just comment on Ian, everything you've said. I can see from my own perspective, it completely resonates. And I can see in the comments in the chat there, it completely resonates with everybody. And when you're talking through those, the authority slide and that borrowed authority and that earned authority, like, actually a lot of that links back to what we talk about in our courses. So when we talk
Yeah,
about getting buy-in, and getting buy-in isn't just about that, as you said, it's not just about the CEO. You've got how many different departments in an organization. You need buy-in right across the board. And ideally at varying levels as well, not just at a senior level, you need it at a ground level up. But we talk about in the diploma and in our advanced certificate as well, we talk about, looking at different factors. So you've your cultural factors. And when we talk about cultural factors, we're talking about, using customer stories. And absolutely, we're probably, I'd say the majority of us in CX are in it because we have huge passion for it.
yes,
And we can talk about it all day long and we can present to people all day long about it. But you do need that to bring in that borrowed authority in to influence those cultural factors. And we talk about cultural factors, we're talking about, what are your customers feeling and saying about the organization, what's happening within the organization. And when we do our courses, we ask people, what is it, if you've got buy-in before to a CX or to a CX initiative or project, what was it? Was there one thing that really got everybody's attention and gave you that light bulb moment for people? And in the majority of cases, the answer isn't from something that they said or did. It's usually actually from using the borrowed authority of
yeah,
customers. And the customers coming in and the customers sharing their stories about what's happened. And then our role as CX leaders is then to bring in what we call the business factors. What does that mean for our bottom line?
absolutely. That
Yeah,
there is a caveat though to what you're saying, because I completely agree with you, Siobhan. But the caveat is we've got to be very careful that we don't humiliate.
absolutely.
I started my career, as Michael knows, in process improvement. So I'm a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, amongst other things. And I've met many process improvement professionals in my career who take great pleasure in telling business leaders that their processes are terrible. Okay, now that is not a way to influence a leader. You know, it's not our job to make them feel like they're doing a bad job. You know, it's actually our role, if we want to earn authority, if we want to influence them, is to demonstrate that we're there to help them. We're not there to humiliate them. We're there to help them gather the facts to help explain why they're not able to do what they need to do as effectively as possible. If you're able to convince leaders that you're like their right hand, you know, let me help you make the experience better. Let me help you make your numbers better. Okay, this is not what happens, unfortunately, very often. You know, because people think they're our numbers. They're not our numbers. They're their numbers. So we've got it again. It's a bit cliche, but we are a bit like internal consultants. But you know how most leaders consider consultants. You know, they don't like consultants. So you've got to convince them that you are there to make them look good. You know, and this is why I also love the expression massaging egos. You know, massage the ego of a senior leader. You make them feel good about themselves, they're going to want your help more and more.
But yeah, okay, so massaging egos, get that, and I think we've all had to play that game in the past. But I think my opening statement, we talked about, you know, most organizations, they claim this customer centricity, but they do behave differently, you know, at the boardroom table. So the question for me is a how question. You know, how do the people who are sitting on this call today, how do they expose the gap in a way that actually drives action rather than defensiveness from the leaders?
So it's a great question, and unfortunately, I am faced with defensiveness on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I'm working with an organization at the moment that it's probably the greatest example of defensiveness I've ever seen in my career. And that's despite putting the facts in front of them. You know, so even if you have the facts, that doesn't guarantee that leaders are going to listen or accept them. You know, this is why it is not always going to be successful bringing customers into a room. You know, and this is why I'm mentioning this point about don't humiliate. You know, don't put leaders on the spot. You know, bringing a customer into the room to tell them how terrible they are, whilst it might be based on fact, that's not going to endear your leaders to you, you know.
And it can't be done as a standalone. I completely agree with you, Ian. No, it has to be done in context and there has to be preparation. And ultimately, you as a CX leader, you as have to position yourself as an ally to all of the different functions because you're not the one that's going to be able to make the change. It's all of those different functions that you need to drive change within. So you have to be an ally and a support, and therefore you need to understand what's their agenda, what's their KPIs that are keeping them awake at night. What are they focused on, and how are you going to be able to support them in delivering on it? So,
and I agree with you. In addition to that, Siobhan, about storytelling. You know, getting colleagues, customers to tell stories is important. I am a huge believer of getting leaders to actually understand the reality of the experience themselves by doing it themselves. Very few leaders have actually interacted with their organizations in exactly the same way that their customers do. You know, that's a very effective way of doing it. But the big but, whilst all of that is powerful, whilst all of that will have an impact, it will get their eyes, you know, wobbling in their heads, it's the money that talks. And if we really want them to understand the impact, we need to put numbers in front of them. But the numbers we need to put in front of them are not necessarily the numbers that we are putting in front of them. You know, and this is why it's important that as experienced management professionals, we leverage every part of the science that is available to us. And one of the benefits of methodologies like Lean and Six Sigma, for example, is that they are very effective at helping us to make a case as to why something is having an impact. Too many experienced management professionals are not focusing on the cost of failure. What they're trying to find is the impact on revenue generation of delivering better experiences, but they're not going to find that immediately. What we can all find almost immediately is the cost of failure in the delivery of the experience today. And if we're able to clearly articulate the cost of failure in delivering the experience, no leader is going to ignore that. That right now, especially in this increasingly economically challenged world, that is going to have the greatest effect at getting their ears to prick up. Then you can start leveraging other things, but get them to understand that there is a tangible cost to this. That the reason, Michael, I obsess with talking about this as a science is because there are too many leaders that think we're the soft and fluffy brigade. We're some kind of weird cult. We're not. There is a tangible impact to this. We're just not, and this is a very broad statement, but as a profession, we've just been very bad at articulating what the impact is.
Interesting. And it kind of fits in because I'm going to wind down. We're going to take some questions shortly, but just maybe to both of you, I'll start with you, Ian. Skeptical executive team, what are your tips for anybody on this call right now to earn their trust? And I don't know if it's an issue of trust, but how do we convert a skeptical executive team? What, to use your term, what brutally honest actions would you advise our people on this call today to take?
So, firstly, you've got to be a realist. You are never going to convince all of them. Okay, there will be some that they just do not care. They're so focused on their own tasks and their own P&L, their own situation, you're never going to convince them. But my guidance is, firstly, if you have a skeptic, you can sometimes use those skeptics to your advantage. Those are the ones that you probably need to massage the ego of even more than you would others. Meet with them one-to-one. Tell them how important they are. Buy them a coffee. Talk to them about what's important to you. What are you trying to do? Don't ignore them. Don't see them as a threat. Just play to them. It's fine. Who cares? But if you make them feel good about themselves, they potentially will turn to help you. But it also comes back to the other point, which I've said earlier already. You've got to work with facts. You have got to give them facts. Don't give them theory. And the final thing, I think I said there were two, but there are three, is one of the mistakes that many practitioners make is that we present information to leaders, but we don't tell them what we want from them.
Yeah.
And I think with a skeptic especially, tell them what you need from them, because they're not going to give you anything unless you specifically ask for it. So tell them, do you know what? I'd love you to talk about customer experience at our town hall meeting next week. What, me? Yeah, I'd love you to just talk about, oh, okay. Just so give them a call to action. Make it very clear why they are critical to the evolution of this. But again, remember, work in the world of realism. Some of them you're never going to convince, but don't alienate them, but don't overinvest in them either.
Love it. Siobhan, how would you address that? What tips would you give for the skeptical executive team to win them over?
Yeah, I think the key thing is it takes time. You're not going to do it in day one. You're not going to do it on a first conversation with a slide deck or a pitch. It takes time to really get to know them. Like I said, to me, the key thing is understand their agenda, understand where their challenges are. And if they are a skeptic, find out why. Understand what assumptions that they have about CX. And, don't try to educate them on everything in those first conversations, because you don't want to come across condescending. They, understand what their challenges are, what their agendas are, but also, when you're find ways to be able to support them with that. Is there a burning platform happening, that within the organization that you can actually say, well, actually, this is an underlying issue here is experience. And actually, if we do this, we can help you with X, Y, and Z metric. And being able to demonstrate the I suppose what you can do for them ultimately is key. And a lot of time, it's not about ROI, and you touched on this as well, Ian. It's not about showing, well, I can earn this and I can have this return on investment, or we can as an organization if we do this. Most organizations and a lot of skeptics are probably quite risk averse. And so in those situations, it's the cost of inaction that is actually really going to get the most attention and probably really convince them more than anything else. So whether that's, are they concerned about losing market share? Are they concerned about reputation? Are they concerned about employee experience or losing experience within the organization? So it's like that, understanding what keeps them awake, understanding what their metrics are, and looking at ways that you can support them in doing that, and just building the relationship over time. Some you'll win, some you'll lose, but lean into, find out who your advocates and
there's a lovely quote here that summarizes, I think, a really good step from you both, from Rashad. Rashad, brilliant. I love it. He says here, we advise organizations on CX and help them walk in their customer shoes every single day. We should be able to walk in the shoes of those leaders as well. Why don't we invest as much time? And that's kind of interesting. I've never looked at that. I've never thought about, if we are investing 100% of our time in walking in our customer shoes, how much time do we invest in walking in the leader's shoes? That's
if I can add something to that, Michael, because it's a very good point. You've heard me say before that I, again, in the spirit of making mistakes, have failed to empathize with senior leaders in the past. I think one of the critical things behind my philosophy in all of this is simplicity. We have very complicated lives. Leaders have remarkably complicated lives, and they have many of their own stakeholders that they have to try and influence, especially the shareholders. And when people like us come along and potentially give them the impression that they need to do even more, that's going to make their lives more difficult, more complicated, again, it's not going to enamor us to them. Many organizations have massively overcomplicated the way that they are managing the experience. It doesn't have to be that way. Actually, if we're operationalizing this effectively, we should be making their lives easier, not more complicated. And Siobhan, I'm sure you will have experienced this, but one of the things that gives me most joy is that when I have a leader come into one of my sessions, often when they've been told to attend, they don't want to be there, when they come up to me at some point during the day and say, do you know what, I was going to leave at the first break, but you've made me realize that this is actually really, really quite important and that it's possible. And so I'm really pleased I'm here. That's what we need to do. We need to allow them to understand this is not difficult. Doesn't mean it's easy. It's not difficult. It just needs commitment and focus.
Absolutely.
Really
simplicity. Keep it as simple as possible. And ultimately, we talk about the internal customers. Those leaders are our internal customers. If you're in a CX role, and you absolutely have to treat them. And Susanna there mentioned about, applying some of the 6 emotional drivers on them. Absolutely, absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's right. Louise, any questions coming through? We've got we're a little over time here, but thank you all for hanging tight. Anything jump out at you when you were looking at questions that you could share?
Yeah, so Laura asks, with regards to borrowed authority, how do you handle situations where senior leaders are seemingly championing CX, but their messaging leans more towards customer service than the end-to-end journey? So they have the visibility, the authority, but their message is slightly misplaced.
So that's an issue of education, obviously, which is quite appropriate when all of us are talking about this. I think what you need to, well, you will know anyway, is that is a demonstration that they have a lack of understanding of what it is that ultimately that they're trying to achieve. I would probably deal with that, and Siobhan, you tell me if you agree, with a discrete one-to-one conversation. I think that's not something that you should raise in front of other people. Again, back to this point of you don't want to humiliate them in any way. But but I would probably have a conversation one-to-one and explain to them the difference between customer service, customer experience, and customer centricity, and that ultimately the objective is to deliver the experience in a customer-centric environment, and customer service is just one element of it. That the other thing to say to them is that they will probably or maybe in a situation where non-customer facing employees think this has nothing to do with them. And customer experience has something to do with everyone. If it's just about customer service, that contradicts that. So one-to-one education is probably the way I would deal with it. I don't know if you agree, Siobhan, or different.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely, absolutely. And the thing is, with this person, it sounds like their intention is there. There's a positive intention. You know, you potentially have an advocate there and an ally that will support you, but it's, I suppose, they have a lack of understanding about what CX is, and doing that in a non-confrontational way, and looking at how can we I approach it as it's great that you're communicating, you're talking about CX. I really need that support, and how can we work together to make sure our messaging is aligned? Because within the organization, we were doing work with an organization just last week, and it's a relatively new CX team, and the importance of everyone within that team having the same messaging came out very, very strongly, and that's something that needs work. So that could be a way you could approach that.
Yeah, I'm picking up on here. It's more common from Christine and Najib, but she also it's summarizing what we've said. She's saying it's very important to read the organization and go with the organization's pace. Otherwise, get the risks of major setbacks. Limit the passion and lead with the facts. That's a great summary, Christine. Thank you very much. And it really is nicely put in place. Louise, anything else there that grabs your attention?
Yeah, so Noshina asks, for someone new to CX with the data as facts, how do you quantify the financial impact to CX decisions or outcomes?
Well, it's a big question. So if you are completely new to CX, then there is a lot of publicly available information, actually, that will help you to build your own repository of evidence, if you like, of the positive financial impact of improving experiences or the negative impact of failing to improve experiences. I'm going to state the obvious here potentially, but if you just go on to Chat GPT, you will find a whole load of information that you can use to build your repository of information. I think it would then be very important for you to earn your own authority by attending some training courses, either from the CX Academy or others are available, but we're here with the CX Academy. So you've earned authority of having the knowledge to talk about this with authority. That I think is very important. In terms of you then being able to determine what the financial impact is in your own organization, it is, in my opinion, setting expectation. Setting expectation with leaders is very important. And I talk about two categories of financial return. The long-term category being revenue generation. That is the long-term financial impact that will come as a result of developing better, longer, deeper relationship with customers over time. That could take a year, it could take 5 years. That's the long-term return. Many leaders expect that within 3 months, and it's not going to happen. And that's why, as I've said already, you need to explore the short to medium term financial return, which comes through cost reduction and cost avoidance. Please note, I'm not saying cost cutting. Cost cutting is different. If you want to cut costs, you can do that immediately, but you'll make the experience worse. Cost reduction and cost avoidance is all about eliminating the things that are going wrong in your customer journey. That can happen almost instantly. And this is why I talked earlier about the importance of trying to get a handle on the cost of failure. If you know what's going wrong in the organization, borrow the authority of someone in the finance team to come up with a calculation of how much is that costing the business. That will be a very powerful way for you to sort of get your CX credentials moving in the right direction.
Siobhan, you're a big fan of that. I've known that when watching you and seeing you work. Make them your best friend. You've often said to me on financial
Yeah, the
controllers,
finance
etc.
team. Absolutely. And
Yeah.
the metrics, and there's another question kind of linked to that around how do we ensure we're measuring the right things? The right things will vary from organization to organization, and actually probably department to department, depending on who you're talking to. But it's understanding the metrics that are most valued within the organization or within the leaders, by the leaders that you're speaking to. And yeah, like a lot of time as CX leaders, we don't automatically have access to that data. So I've said before, make the finance teams your best friend.
Yeah,
You need
absolutely.
to have them on board to get the access to that data to be able to tell that story. But another area I'm hugely passionate about is customer journey mapping, which will help you identify where those failures are happening, where that additional cost is coming in. Do you have a lot of organizations do have access quite easily to your first call resolution rates. And if you have a number, a cost of per call, that's a quick and dirty calculation that you can do to bring a story to life, and to show impact to the bottom line.
I've jotted down here. I've been trying to put a summary theme to what's been discussed today, and I had evidence delivered with passion is something strong, and it's changing now to say commercial evidence delivered with passion. So for me, I think the real key thing here is let's park our desk outside the financial department for a while. Burn a pathway on the rug to their department and just start getting to understand, what's the key evidence out there to make this work. But again, I think what we're saying, not just somebody's made a great point here, is that the greatest challenge for me was connecting CX with business impact. Based on my experience, most executives do not ignore CX because they dislike customers. They ignore it because CX is often presented as feedback, sentiment, or isolated pain points. I think that's really good. Raphael, thank you so much for that. So again, I'm leaning towards this commercial evidence, but no harm delivering it with passion, as long as there's many voices delivering it. Because if you're the same voice delivering with passion, you start to get boring. You start to do my head. So we need teams of people to deliver this commercial evidence with passion. I think that's a great solution.
Exactly.
Louise, anything else there that is screaming for an answer?
Yeah, so both Caroline and Sarah both ask, is there a formula to determine the cost of failure?
Not specifically, but a way of thinking about it is, so a slightly different way of thinking about it. There is a traditional contact center metric called cost to serve. So any of you listening that have worked in the world of contact centers will have an understanding of that. If you expanded the principle of cost to serve to the cost of delivering the end-to-end customer journey and everything within it, the same principle. What is the cost of delivering each touch point in the customer journey? So you need to know what the journey looks like to be able to do that. So coming back to Siobhan's point, that this again is why customer experience needs to be understood as a science. This is a science made up of interconnecting competencies. And if you are not understanding of all of them, you won't be able to do that. So how much does it cost to answer the phone? How much does it cost to deal with an inquiry? How much does it cost to make a delivery? Your finance team will be able to help you to determine what those costs are. And then as you know that the failure rate of those things, if you are mapping and measuring the journey effectively, that's where you'll start to be able to determine where the prize is.
Love it. Love it. Anything else, Louise? And then we're going to wrap this up because I see we're getting to the hour and we don't generally hit the hour. So, Louise, anything else there that we might want to address?
Yes, so Christine asks, how can we measure emotional experience in CX beyond the typical satisfaction surveys?
Oh, that's a question, isn't it? So we probably don't have enough time to go into this in detail, but my response will be we've reached this is a webinar in itself, by the way, Michael, but we've reached a tipping point in the way that VOC has been gathered traditionally. Surveys being pushed to customers, I would argue, for at least 10 years has been largely providing an inaccurate representation of customer perception. A very quick answer, but without going into detail, is going forward, we need to be able to combine multiple sources of insight together. Both insight that we are generating through pushing surveys, but also unsolicited data that is being left online, that is coming through inquiries and various other things. The evolution of VOC is the greatest opportunity with AI. AI being able to interpret multiple sources of data is most likely to give you the answer to that question. But it would take far too long to
Sure.
give you a
Let
detailed
me
answer.
add something to that, Ian, as a quick one to Christine's question. Christine, one of the things that we have noted over the years is that, yes, we do a huge amount of measurement and surveys with our customers. And sometimes, like we have 6 emotional drivers, so we're able to measure those, get customers' feedback all the time. And what we sometimes do is we overlay the same survey with leadership feedback, get them to rank how you're doing in those
Yep.
emotional drivers. And what's really interesting, Christine, is that if you see a huge gap between what the leadership team are saying and the customers, we have issues. What you tend to find, though, is that there will be some departments in your organization that are closer to the customers, and they tend to score very similarly with the customer scores. But it's the leadership who tend to think, their expectations are, they don't appreciate the customer's expectations, and they think they're doing a great job. So, Christine, that might be something you would
And
look
to
at
be
in the
honest,
future.
voice of the employee in general,
Yes,
Michael,
yes,
which is not
absolutely.
employee engagement, but as
Yep.
someone said to me in Johannesburg last week, or 2 weeks ago, voice of the voiceless,
Yeah,
which I
very good.
thought was quite a nice way of
No, I
describing
love
it.
it. I love it. Siobhan, have you anything to add before we wrap up? Are we okay?
I think we're all good. I think Ian has covered everything for us. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so
Yeah.
much for lending your time and coming on board.
Well, as you know, I like talking about this subject, so it's a pleasure as always.
No, you're great, Ian. Thank you so much. And again, I can summarize: commercial evidence delivered with passion. That's not a bad outtake from this today. And let's start getting smart and clever and engage with those voices that are heard regularly, i.e., the financial controllers, etc. And let's start developing deeper relationships here to provide that really smart evidence. So again, Ian, thank you so much. Honestly,
Such a pleasure, guys.
we've enjoyed this, and we've always had great conversations in the past. And thank you so much for your time, everybody. We're getting phenomenal feedback from all over the world, as normal. Well done, you. Thank you, Louise. As always, thanks for setting this up, getting such a great crew here today. And Siobhan, thank you for coming in and fixing all my mistakes as I go through the questions. So well done. You played brilliantly. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
And I will say, we will follow up with everybody. We will send you a link. So if you need to follow up directly with Ian, I know that we will send that to you shortly. We'll also send you the slides that were presented today in case you want to refer to. And we'll also send you a recording if you want to share that with your colleagues, etc. So enjoy, everybody, and look after yourselves today. And Ian, thanks again. God bless everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Take care.
Michael.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.